What are typical signs that it's trauma, not ADHD? ADHD is missing in the discussion. Comparison of ADHD and PTSD. Here you go. Is it complex trauma or ADHD? There are some signs which are very strong indicators for complex trauma, but not for ADHD. Still, those two conditions are often not that easy to distinguish from one another. Therefore, many of you ask for a comparison between ADHD and trauma, and this is why today we'll discuss 7 signs that it's complex trauma and not ADHD. And in the end of this episode, I will also present to you the full Venn diagram of CPTSD versus ADHD. Let's dive right into it. Welcome to this episode. My name is Robert, and before we start, this video is the first one of a 3-part series on ADHD and complex trauma, pretty similar what we did for autism, whether it's a highly sensitive person. And this first episode is all about identifying symptoms of complex trauma. In the next episode, we will then focus on the whole ADHD side of things and symptoms as well. And in the third video, we will talk about a combined type where both conditions are present, and we also talk about which treatments are helpful, because it's very common that ADHD and complex trauma occur together in one spectrum and one condition. I do this series because it's such a difficult task to distinguish between those two. Some clinicians say we're misdiagnosing ADHD as trauma. Others say we're overdiagnosing trauma and miss out the ADHD. Very often, as I said, they occur together, or trauma even triggers and activates predispositional ADHD. Let's start, as always, with some clear definitions so we're all on the same page. So what is CPTSD? CPTSD stands for Complex Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder, and we summarize that condition as traumatic reactions of a prolonged or accumulated series of small, unfavorable events, often during childhood, that then cause complex trauma in adulthood. And those people who are affected have been living in an abusive household or facing chronic neglect during childhood. Studies estimate that around 13 to 30% of people experience CPTSD-related symptoms as grown-ups. And typical characteristics for CPTSD are, for example, somatic symptoms and reactions such as hypervigilance, which means that you're always on alert, chronic pain, or emotional flashbacks. We'll cover all of these symptoms in today's episode. And unlike ADHD, which you are born with, CPTSD is shaped by the experiences you go through, often when you're young and vulnerable. Let's talk about ADHD here as well. In the next episode, we will go more in depth about the ADHD side. So just a quick definition here. ADHD stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. It's a neurodevelopmental disorder that affects roughly 5% of adults worldwide. Other sources even name 6 to 7 or 11%. So it depends, but it's definitely around that, in that range. Usually ADHD is diagnosed in children already. It runs in families, so there is definitely a genetic link. Studies show that there is a roughly 80% chance to get ADHD if your parents also had it. So usually ADHD is an innate neurodivergence, which means that you're born with it. Major characteristic symptoms of ADHD are, for example, inattention. So that means a difficulty for regulating attention, impulsivity, and also hyperactivity. What you see in ADHD basically is that this neurodiversity in the brain creates differences in dopamine regulation in the brain, which is the main reason for lacks of motivation or focus differences, or the difficulty to regulate attention. Let's start with the 7 signs of complex trauma without any more waiting time. And again, we just focus on the CPTSD side of things here. So we discuss symptoms which are typical for complex trauma, but which are often misdiagnosed as a part of ADHD. The first clear symptom that it's CPTSD and not ADHD are attachment problems. Attachment issues are one of the major symptoms that are very typical for early trauma and definitely not for ADHD. In CPTSD survivors, typically relationships are influenced by the condition, by CPTSD. And the reason for that is that close relationships, especially with caregivers, have felt unsafe to the child. Attachment and safe relationships are basic needs for children. And those experiences that children made early on disrupted a person's sense of safety in those relationships with the mom, with the dad, or with the caregiver in general. And in cases of disrupted attachment as a child, people then develop different insecure attachment styles as adults. There are basically 3 insecure attachment styles that can be a consequence out of that. The first one is the anxious attachment. We also call it the insecure ambivalent type, and this type is existent in around 18 to 20% of the population. People of this type are usually described as contradictory attached or ambivalent. Then we have avoidant attachment. That's also called the insecure avoidant type. Again, 18 to 20% of the population are also this type. And people of this type are described as having a kind of pseudo-independence. They have a noticeable avoidance behavior, and they also apply compensating strategies through, for example, hobbies, but also through work, sports, affairs, friends, or other addictions or distractions. And then we also have the disorganized type, that's the third type, also known as the chaotic type or the fearful avoidant type. So it's a mixed type here. And this type only exists in around 2% of the population. People of this type are described as showing behaviors like freezing, chaotic, and destructive relationship dynamics, as well as a lack of emotion. That's also a possible thing here. I made a full episode about all of these insecure attachment types, which I will link to you up here and in the description below. And if we compare those attachment issues to ADHD, we can see that ADHD can also impact relationships, obviously, but it's due to the impulsivity or forgetfulness, inattention, but it doesn't cause deep-seated attachment issues in people, which then last into adulthood. People with ADHD might also struggle with attention in relationships, but they usually don't experience the fear of abandonment or the fear of commitment here, the difficulty to trust in other people, which is so typical for CPTSD. Let's talk about sign number 2, hypervigilance and not hyperactivity. While hyperactivity is one of the major characteristics in ADHD here, in CPTSD we don't see such a trait. What we see here instead in complex trauma is, for example, the symptom of hypervigilance. And hypervigilance is the sense of being constantly alert, as I said, of being constantly ready to fight. So you feel that there is a lot of tension within your body. If you have that, for example, I have that. I'm often quite hypervigilant. This is why we call those people who have this sense of hypervigilance also eggshell personalities. Feel really thin-skinned, like an egg. Can't really set boundaries, can't really, feel safe around other people and in relationships. That's hypervigilance. What we do if we have that, we constantly scan the environment all around us for potential threats. And it doesn't matter if there is actually a threat or not, we constantly feel, that there's something going on. Maybe you know that, then you're also one of the hypervigilant personalities. And this hyper-alert state is also not just about energy. Okay, it's a survival mechanism, and it's really deeply rooted in our trauma. It was something that we used to do to feel safe and to protect ourselves. Now, where does it actually come from, and what is the physical reaction out of that? Well, it's also rooted in the brain, because the brain has been trained to stay on guard and to detect possible dangers. and to avoid those. And this might also mean that being overly aware of people's body language, of people's tone or voice or changes in the environment, even in situations, as I said, where there is no actually threat going on. Hypervigilance is also mentioned in my favorite paper about CPTSD, right here, Adult Survivors of Childhood Trauma, and it is described as an irritability and chronic hyperarousal, what it basically is. In ADHD, we often, if the person is not traumatized, we often don't have a sense for hypervigilance. Instead, we have something we can call hyperactivity. And hyperactivity then looks like physical restlessness or looks like impulsive actions that can occur in a person with ADHD. And someone with ADHD might blurt out answers or move around a lot. That's more like the restless side of that, which can also be a symptom of hypervigilance, of course. So being restless, I have that sometimes, that I'm really nervous in my legs, okay, and I need to move because that's this fight or flight response in my body rising. The thing here with hypervigilance is a hypervigilant person is more mentally on edge. It doesn't always show physical restlessness, or it does show physical restlessness, but after a long time of being in that state. It's often more the case that a person with CPTSD might be sitting still, but being mentally on edge, being really alert, everything around them, and being ready to fight, ready to flight, ready to flee. Now, somatic symptoms in general, like hypervigilance or hyperactivity also, are usually caused by a dysregulated and highly sensitive central nervous system, which is so typical for ADHD and complex trauma. And I want to remind you that we have a full free workbook full of re-regulation tools and resources, including also writing techniques and skills to calm down the central nervous system. If you want to get that book, just go to understandable.net/book and learn to re-regulate your nervous system now. Link is also in the description below. And let's continue with sign number 3, that it's CPTSD and not ADHD. And we call it emotional flashbacks and dissociation. Yes, that's another typical symptom for complex trauma, and emotional flashbacks, as well as those states of re-experiencing, they often are misinterpreted as panic attacks. But they come up in specific moments in your daily life and usually during trigger situations. And this is why usually those are not panic attacks, but are more flashbacks, re-experiencing, but they can feel pretty similar, or they can even lead to a panic attack. What happens here is that emotional flashbacks bring back the feelings associated with trauma. Often those are panic, shame, fear, or helplessness. I have that sometimes when I'm feeling like triggered and I feel really helpless. I just fall back into that inner child and it gives me this emotional flashback. But there's not a clear memory attached here. It's just this emotional state where my body puts me back in. When you have that, it feels like that you're suddenly feeling the same emotions that you felt during a traumatic experience back in the day, even if you don't really remember this event itself. They're also a huge reason why so many people avoid relationships or are afraid of commitment, because they associate close relationships with these primal, emotional and very painful flashbacks. And those emotional states often come out of the amygdala, our center in the brain where all of our emotions are processed. Dissociation itself is another coping mechanism in people with complex trauma. And dissociation is often a consequence which occurs in moments of emotional flashbacks or trigger situations. Dissociation basically means, or is simply spoken, when the mind and the body are kind of separated from each other in emotionally incapable situations. So when you feel really overwhelmed, what you will see is, and when you have complex trauma, that things get blurry and you somehow feel separated. I also describe it quite often that it feels like if I drank kind of 2 beers or something, Okay, so I'm a bit like numb in my body. To explain that, what happens here is when you're triggered, when you're in a flashback situation, then the brain essentially shuts down. It shuts down emotionally and creates a sensation of detachment here. And this can look like, as I said, becoming numb, zoning out, or also feeling as, for some people, if you're watching yourself from the outside. But that does not occur to everyone, because dissociation also exists on the spectrum itself. And when you have like a mild state of dissociation, that's like something that athletes also experience when they're really in the flow state, when you do sports and when you're really in that tunnel. But severe states of dissociation can also look like states of depersonalization or derealization, that you just cannot really identify yourself anymore, or that you can't really identify the world around you anymore. And this is because you don't feel safe in that situation. I made a full episode about dissociation already, which I will link to you up here and in the description below. In the paper Adult Survivors of Childhood Trauma, there's also dissociation and re-experiencing here. Re-experiencing itself can also show itself as nightmares, but also as flashbacks or vivid intrusive memories. This is how they describe it here. And they describe dissociation as where the survivors lose track of time and place, or have intense experience of depersonalization or derealization. So basically what I explained as well. And dissociation can also be a part of ADHD, and then it's experienced in situations of pure overwhelm, because again, it's linked to an overwhelmed or over-aroused central nervous system, which makes sense then. And also in ADHD, we see states of inattention, which often are, misdiagnosed as dissociation, but it's not the same thing actually. So ADHD inattention can make people lose focus or make them daydream, but it's not triggered by emotional distress, and that's the basic difference here. Instead, it's often caused by boredom or the need for stimulation. Okay, for example, a person with ADHD might start thinking about something else during a task, simply because their brain seeks something more engaging, but not because of an emotional trigger. We also see a similar thing in many people today, because we all consume a lot of stuff on our computers or on our phone. And what we see then is, if we are constantly on TikTok, if we are constantly on Instagram, on YouTube, consume a lot of content, constantly listening to something or watching something, we also kind of rape our dopamine system. Okay, we constantly get these dopamine hits and we get used to it, and therefore our dopamine system is also kind of dysregulated. And that's pretty similar to what we see in ADHD. So I think that when it comes to inattention and when it comes to this state of often being bored, that's also because we constantly kind of fuck up our dopamine system. Let's talk about sign number 4, the low self-esteem. Very typical for people with CPTSD, so for people with unresolved trauma, is this low self-esteem. And that's not typical for ADHD. While both conditions, CPTSD and ADHD, can involve feelings of inadequacy, they stem from different sources and they show up in different ways. In ADHD, low self-esteem can also exist, but it comes often with a history of struggles of, for example, being different, feeling like an alien, or being seen as the person that could never sit still or focus. Those things may lead to feelings of failure and therefore create a very particular sense of low self-esteem or of inadequacy. With CPTSD, however, self-criticism is typically much deeper and harsher. It's not just about the feeling of being inadequate or being different. It's an intense, almost punishing inner voice rooted in past trauma and negative experiences here. CPTSD survivors have a very loud inner critic. And that self-criticism can feel like an unrelenting inner dialogue that constantly judges or blames them. This voice often echoes messages they received in childhood from their mom, from their dad, and especially if they were criticized by their caregivers, feel shame or feel neglected by them. It's a feeling of, I'm not just making mistakes, I am the mistake. I am fundamentally flawed. This is what people with complex trauma may have learned. And this often even goes down to the level of their identity. Perfectionism is also worth to be mentioned here, because this is a way to avoid further judgment or rejection. And those people might constantly thrive to prove their worth, fearing that any mistake confirms their deepest fears about themselves. And this is one of the main differences here in comparison to people with ADHD. People with ADHD often experience low self-esteem due to consistent struggles with tasks that others seem to handle easily. For example, forgetting appointments, missing deadlines, or making impulsive decisions. Those can lead to a sense of disappointment in oneself. However, this self-criticism usually revolves around specific behaviors rather than that core sense of self or this core sense of worthlessness. Again, those two conditions, as we'll see in part 3 of this series, can occur together. So when you're someone with ADHD and with trauma, then you definitely, probably have this sense of low self-esteem. Sign number 5, that it's CPTSD, not ADHD, toxic shame and guilt. And if I could name just one typical sign for complex trauma, it would be toxic shame and guilt. I myself, I'm also affected by that, so I know what I'm talking about here. Toxic shame is a thing for CPTSD because it's a sensation which is deeply rooted within a distorted core identity and sense of self. That means people with CPTSD may have experienced environments where they were frequently blamed, shamed, or criticized. It's often also mainly about the perception of things. So many people who have complex trauma as adults, they think back to their childhood and they think, well, my childhood was kind of good. It was not that bad, but I still somehow feel this sense of shame and guilt quite often. This is not because your childhood was that bad. It is because your perception of your childhood was that bad. So you experienced the interaction with your mom, with your dad, with your caregivers as traumatic, or as, you have been neglected, manipulated, abused. Your experience and your perception of that experience is what causes toxic shame now in your adult life. As a result, for many adults, even small, harmless mistakes can activate these deep-seated feelings of shame. So we also talk about, many people say that quite often, I'm easily triggered, or I'm triggered by that, I'm irritated, I'm really thin-skinned, I'm really sensitive, I'm an eggshell personality, this is why. In the paper Adult Survivors of Childhood Trauma, shame is described as a poor sense of self, including beliefs that they are fundamentally defective, toxic, or worthless. So we also talk about an affected belief system here, and that's because the sense of toxic shame is really deeply rooted within our major belief system, really deep down in here. Trauma expert Tim Fletcher talks in his YouTube presentations about the toxic shame persona. So this is his model here. In the middle, we have the real self. That's the core. That's your true, authentic core. And around that true core, we have built up a shame-based self, or again, the inner critic here, which is so typical for complex trauma survivors. And around that, we have the persona and the ideal self. Now, to understand that is, every one of us has this true inner authentic self. This is how we are. Pure you, pure me. Usually, you would express that. You would show your emotions because emotions are part of that. You would express your needs. You would set your boundaries, do all that. This is you. This is you trying to protect yourself and express yourself. Now, if those things are somehow distorted or disrupted because your caregivers told you this emotion is bad, this need is wrong, you shouldn't set that boundary, what you do then is you develop this inner critic, because the inner critic is constantly repeating those things. Yeah, my emotion is bad and I'm wrong and I shouldn't set that boundary, and therefore you develop this sense of shame around these emotions, traits, boundaries, needs. And what you do instead is, in people with autism, we would say it's masking. I think we all do that. We build up an ideal self, an ideal mask, a character of how we would like to be. So we don't get criticized or judged for those emotions, needs, traits, boundaries. That's the ideal self in his model here. And this is what toxic shame in simple words is. The shame-based persona is like a layer around the real self. It's like a mask or a character we like to play. And you learn to play this character, this role, already early on in your life in order to survive within your given environment and your caregiver's situation. Well, in ADHD, shame and guilt might show up after impulsive decisions or after missed responsibilities, but it's usually a more frustrated based, like, I wish I could do this better sensation. So people with ADHD may feel guilt over how their actions affect others. And people with ADHD who don't have complex trauma, the core identity is not necessarily being influenced and distorted by this strong sense of shame and guilt. But really important to mention here is that I said in the beginning, toxic shame, complex trauma, and ADHD usually occur together or quite often. So someone who has complex trauma can also have ADHD. Talk that in video number 3. But for now, sign number 6, avoidance and not inattention. Avoidance and inattention are two completely different mechanisms and concepts, though they are sometimes mistaken. For those people with complex trauma, avoidance isn't just forgetting to do something or struggling to stay focused. It's an intentional, still most of the time unconscious effort to avoid anything or anyone that could bring up painful memories or make them feel vulnerable in a way. And this can also include avoiding social situations, difficult conversations, or even entire relationships, especially intimate ones, or even certain emotions that remind them of past trauma. It's like the mind is constantly saying, I don't want to go there, it's too painful. But it's not actively doing that, it's more happening subconsciously. It's creating a physical reaction within your body, which often is linked to a bad gut feeling. Okay, this is what people feel then. I have this bad gut feeling. It's not often intuition here. It's also that we misinterpret this bad gut feeling with intuition. Okay, we think, well, this person is not good for me. Well, sometimes that's totally true. But sometimes it's just this traumatic reaction that you believe that this person could hurt you, which is not necessarily the case. Now, avoidance, again, in the paper, which I have here, is described as avoidance of thoughts, memories, or reminders of triggers. Behaviors which are linked to avoidance are substance abuse here, eating disorders, or also disruptive behaviors. Avoidant behaviors may also be traditionally considered as positive behaviors sometimes, until they become maladaptive. Why positively? Because those things could also be, for example, if you work a lot or if you do a lot of sports to avoid other things. I already made a full episode about why we isolate and avoid other people, which I will link to you up here in the description below. And people with ADHD, they don't necessarily show avoidant behaviors, but they show inattentive behaviors, which is not the same thing, but it's often, difficult to distinguish here for some people. Now, in ADHD, inattention is often unintentional as well. A person with ADHD might drift off during a conversation or get distracted by something more interesting, but it's not because they're avoiding anything painful, it's just because they have this difficulty in regulating their attention. It's also not because they're dissociative, it's simply, again, a struggle to sustain focus here. Another aspect is that ADHD-related inattention is usually less emotionally charged and doesn't carry any weight of avoiding past pain. And sign number 7, we talk about physical or somatic symptoms here. One last big indicator of complex trauma are physical symptoms. Physical symptoms, also known as somatic symptoms, are always present in trauma survivors. And that's because the body does always react first. Peter Levine made that pretty popular. And more precisely is what we mean when we say our body reacts first is that the central nervous system detects threats or memorizes specific emotions and therefore warns us in trigger situations. Somatic symptoms then can be chronic pain, pressure in your gut, pressure in your chest, in your throat, chronic fatigue, irritable bowel syndrome, heavy sweating, those kind of things. So everything which is closely related to a heavy reaction in the central nervous system. And these physical reactions can be triggered by specific situations, but also by specific people, or even certain smells or sounds that are subconsciously connected to past trauma and unfavorable experiences. This can make the person feel on edge or unsafe, even if they're logically know that there is no real danger around. And what's happening here is that the body's alarm system gets activated without an obvious reason here. And we see those physical, often medically unexplainable symptoms in people with complex trauma. This is where they come from. Now you know, they come from your activated nervous system because your body reminds a specific past situation or unfavorable experience. In ADHD, physical symptoms do also exist, but they are usually related to hyperactivity or restlessness and not to past trauma. Someone with ADHD might tap their foot, fidget or move around, but it's not because of a deep-seated response to trauma, it's because their brain seeks stimulation. And ADHD doesn't typically involve somatic symptoms like nausea, pain or tiredness tied to those past experiences. Now, after hearing all of these CPTSD specific symptoms, did you identify yourself with probably dealing with CPTSD? If so, I have a solution for you right now, because if you're looking for an affordable way to resolve these symptoms, we have an online community platform for people like us. And the community we have is a safe space for people with CPTSD, but also for sensitive people, for people with ADHD, autism, and what we have in our platform is that we also offer guiding online courses that show you a step-by-step path on how to resolve those symptoms which are basically, influenced by your central nervous system and by past trauma. There you find all resources and support you need to re-regulate your nervous system and to resolve those symptoms, and you can access the full platform, including the community and the courses, now as a member at understandable.net/join. Go to understandable.net/join, become a member today. And now let's have a look at the Venn diagram of ADHD and CPTSD. When we look at the Venn diagram now, we also will see some aspects we'll talk about in the next episode. And what we see here, when we look at the overlap, we have on the left side all of the CPTSD symptoms. We have attachment problems that we talked about, hypervigilance here, emotional flashbacks, low self-esteem, toxic shame and guilt, avoidance, isolation, and physical symptoms. On the right side, this is what we talk about in the next episode, we have the ADHD side, hyperactivity, impulsivity, self-criticism around ADHD behaviors, inattention, hyperfocus, and task completion and time management problems. And then we have a look at the overlap now. In the overlap, we have dissociation that we talked about. Dissociation in CPTSD, because of trigger situations and emotional flashbacks, we dissociate, we separate body and mind, and ADHD in really overwhelming situations. Dissociation as well as emotional dysregulation are reactions from a really sensitive nervous system. And this is why I also put high sensitivity here. Then there's also the tendency for substance abuse. That's especially typical for ADHD, but also for CPTSD. So we see that in both conditions. When we look at this overlap, we see a link here between heavy emotional and physical reactions and a really sensitive central nervous system. I talked about this overlap already in this episode. I will link to you the episode in the description below. There we talked about the overlap between all neurodivergent conditions and complex trauma, and we came to the same conclusion that the central nervous system and the sensitivity of that nervous system is what results in those symptoms. These are the major things that overlap between CPTSD and ADHD, but other possibilities which I didn't put in the Venn diagram here because I think they're not specific enough are things such as anxiety, mood disorders, irritability, sleeplessness and sleep disruptions, and difficulties with focus and attention due to dissociation, for example. Those things can also be in the middle of the Venn diagram, which overlap in both conditions as well. And now in the last part of this video, I like to talk about solutions here. You could always say, why does it really matter to get the right diagnosis? I mean, why do we even need to categorize everything? Why do we need a concept for CPTSD and a concept for ADHD? Well, it's because we have different treatment paths in those conditions. And it's really important to find the right condition and the right treatment to get appropriate therapy here. ADHD and CPTSD definitely require different approaches in therapy. ADHD treatment might focus on managing attention and impulsivity with behavioral strategies or even medication, while CPTSD needs more trauma-focused therapies, for example, such as somatic therapy. Misdiagnoses mean you might miss out on the support that actually makes a difference. And I already made a full episode on trauma treatments, so if you identify yourself as having, more trauma-related symptoms, definitely watch this episode, link that in the description below. And if you see yourself in both lists, it's definitely possible, as I said, to have ADHD and CPTSD, and we'll talk about that in the third episode of this series, so definitely subscribe so you won't miss that. But knowing the primary driver of your symptoms is very important though for getting the right help. So working with a therapist who understands both conditions can definitely make the difference here if you have a specialist who knows precisely what you're dealing with. And if you want to work on your healing journey yourself, again, a community like ours full of resources can definitely be very helpful. So what do you think about the topic? Do you identify with the symptoms of CPTSD, or are you looking forward to the next episode where we talk about the symptoms of ADHD? Definitely leave me a comment below what you think. If you want to support the podcast, subscribe here on YouTube, on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, leave a 5-star review. And I see and speak to you next Sunday for the next episode here on the channel. Have a great day.